Good evening, and what can I tell you? Welcome back, Rob Kateers, to Sentimental Elephants, a musical journey where we discuss about the evolution of tastes in music, particularly my own. I'm your genial host, Rob. It's been a hot minute, but we're back for the next installment. Moving on to the letter C, like I said in one of the earlier videos, that the foundation of my music taste is built on artists that I used to hate. I think this is going to be a kind of an example of this, showing how opinion can turn around on a band. So as I said, we're on letter C. C is for The Clash. It's for Johnny Cash, Catherine Wheel, Charlatans, The Church, Gene Clark, The Cure, Caravan, John Coltrane, Elvis Costello, Eric Clapton. And for today, C is for Chicago, Chicago. Yeah, we're going to be talking about, back in a shot here, we're going to be talking about the band Chicago. A lot to talk about with this one. That's probably why it took so long to get to this one. I'm going to dedicate this particular video to Dave W. and Jeff. They are very, individually, very, very significant figures in my becoming a fan of the band Chicago. So let's talk a little bit about history. Chicago was formed in, guess where? Chicago, Illinois. Musicians who'd been in a number of different bands. Original name was The Big Thing, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Eventually became Chicago Transit Authority, which was the name on their first album, and subsequently changed their name to Chicago. They self-describe as a rock and roll band with horns. The original members of the band were Danny Serafin on drums, James, had a bit of a senior moment there. James Pankow on trombone, Lee Loughnane on trumpet, Walter Parazater on sax and flute and other woodwinds, Robert Lamb on keyboards and vocals, Terry Kath on guitar and vocals, and Peter Cetera on bass guitar and vocals. We'll be talking a fair amount about all the vocalists, but we'll be talking certainly a fair amount about Peter Cetera. There's a lot to say about him. They kicked off their career with 3 straight double albums, followed by a quadruple live album. I'm not sure if anybody's ever done a non-archival quadruple live album, and at least in the vinyl era. I can't think of anybody else, at least in the rock, pop, or soul sphere. There's some triples, but not really any quadruples that I can think of. But Chicago at Carnegie Hall is indeed one of those. They had a lot of hit singles throughout their career, but initially their focus wasn't so much on singles. They were more instrumental. They mixed jazz and rock, and a bit of some classical influences, a bit of soul. Their first number 1 single came in 1976 with the song "If You Leave Me Now," and this kind of embedded them in the minds of people as, this is what Chicago's all about. It's these soft, gentle ballads sung by Peter Cetera, and that's frankly was my view of them for quite a long period of time. That's how a lot of people tend to think of them. There is more to them, but as I say, this was their first number 1 single. In 1978, Terry Kath, lead guitar player, he died, a handgun-related accident. I don't really want to dwell on that story, but it's very, sad that it happened. It really, really was a jarring point in their history. You can look it up if you want. They spent a few years after that kind of in the wilderness. They were still recording and under contract, but not having much success. The original replacement for Terry Kath was a guy named Donnie Dacus, who played the role of Wolf in the movie version of the musical Hair. That's not generally considered the best part of their career. They did have a comeback in the early 80s with David Foster, Canadian, producing, and they started having hit singles again. The the focus did very strongly shift to Peter Cetera, and again, the sort of soft ballad identity. Even though actually some of the hit singles they had that time weren't really that soft ballads. Along Comes a Woman and Stay the Night had a bit more punch to them. But generally they're thought of as a soft rock band, and that was that. He left Peter Cetera, that is, left in 1985. Took him a little bit of time to regroup, but they did have some more hit singles after that. Will You Still Love Me, with Cetera's replacement Jason Scheff on lead vocals. That was a pretty big hit. And they had another number one hit, a song called Look Away, which was sung by Bill Champlin, who was a later addition to the band. He used to be in the band Sons of Champlin. And they've kept going in one form or another. There's been a number of shifts in the lineup. I believe it was 2014 is when they went into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and they're still a touring act to this day. So, what's my story with Chicago? First memories of Chicago. Well, I always knew that I should say always, but I knew that there was a band called Chicago. They're obviously a very big band. As a child, I wasn't sure I could identify too many songs with them. I did. The first song I remember knowing about them was If You Leave Me Now. Again, this was a very, very big hit, and it's a beautiful song. First significant thing I remember about them was the death of Terry Kath. I did know that, as I was about a bit short of 8 years old when it happened. It's one of the earlier celebrity deaths I remember. One of the earliest. I remember Elvis, and then I do remember Terry Kath, and there was a number of people. The Pope died in, I think 2 popes died in 1978, and a few other people. But one of the earliest celebrity deaths I remember was Terry Kath. Didn't really, again, I just knew, okay, there is this band out there called Chicago. The first new single that I really remember hearing, because I remember I saw a video for it, was Stay the Night, during that Peter Cetera, lead vocal, David Foster producing, early 80s era. I remember seeing the video with Peter Cetera getting into various mishaps because he's gets fixated on this very pretty woman. I looked this up recently. The actress who played her was named Ingrid Anderson. She was quite the attractive early 80s a woman in the, I remember, it's a long time since I've seen the video. Like I say, that one had a kind of a bit of punch to it, but subsequent to that, mostly what I was hearing were these, again, the soft ballads, and that's just not where I was at that point. It didn't really hold my interest. I thought, okay, there's this like wimpy kind of mushy ballad band. I did not care for the Cetera single that he did for the Karate Kid, The Glory of Love. I thought his vocals were a bit too soft and mushy in those. So it was a bit of a surprise when I heard some of his earlier vocals, but we'll come to that in a bit. But just overall impression, Chicago, that's not a band I need to think about at all. It's this kind of mushy band. Ignored them for years, and then at some point in the early 2000s, I was out with my friend Dave W. Came of the first part of the dedication. We were hanging out and having a bite to eat, and some music was playing in the restaurant, and a song came on, which I later discovered was Beginnings by... is it Beginnings or Beginning, singular? Anyway, the song comes on, and Dave mentions, oh, this is by an early song by Chicago, and I just, some sort of derisive snort of, ugh, or whatever. And then Dave says, no, this is a really cool song. There's this bit at the end where the horn section are like all playing hand percussion, and there's this kind of long, cool solo at the end. And says, oh, okay, and I'm kind of listening to it, like, yeah, actually, this is a pretty cool song. Yeah, I really liked it. It wasn't what I was used to thinking of Chicago. It wasn't a ballad. It was more horn-driven, a lot more jazzy, and I like jazz. And there was this very cool long bit at the end with the, a lot of hand percussion being played. So that put them back onto my radar, which I never thought they would be. And there's a couple of other kind of coincidental things pushing me towards them at that time. One is I got a boxed set for Deep Purple called, I believe, Listen, Learn, Read On. And there's a section where they have tracks made by individual members of Deep Purple before they joined the band. And the one from David Coverdale was from his old band, The Government. And it was a cover of a Chicago Transit Authority song called Does Anybody Really Know What Time It Is? And I thought it was a very cool song, actually. I gotta stop saying the word actually. But I did think it was a cool song. Maybe there's more to these guys than I thought there was. Also, that was a period when I just started downloading a lot of, recorded live shows, a lot of live recordings. Started with the Grateful Dead, but moved on to any other artist I could find that interested me. I found a recording of the Texas International Pop Festival, I believe it was, in 1969. And there's a lot of big bands that performed there. There's a notable early performance by Led Zeppelin, and it's a great set from them. There's other bands like Santana, Sly and the Family Stone. It was the first time I heard Rotary Connection. There's a great set by Spirit. And there was a set by Chicago Transit Authority. And I was trying to listen to the whole set and check out all of the different bands that played. And the Chicago Transit Authority was really good. There's some amazing instrumental work. And I've taken it as a sign I'm being sold on this band. So I got the first two Chicago albums, Chicago Transit Authority and Chicago. Again, they were both doubles. They were on one CD. Yes, I bought CDs then, and I still do now. And I really enjoyed them. That said, I wasn't sure how far to get into them because I didn't know when it shifted over to the music that I really didn't care for. So I didn't explore them that much further. I just had these two albums that I liked a lot. Again, fast forward a couple of decades later, not quite then, but a number of years. This is, think about it, in the year post-divorce, or this point I'm living on my own. And my good friend Jeff, the other person I'm dedicating this to, suggested that you might want to check out the documentary on Chicago that's on Netflix. Side note, if you look for it on Netflix, it's not there anymore, which is why I have it on DVD. That's the thing about streaming services. Everything's available there until it's not. Yes, I'm an old fogey, but hey, I still have all my stuff on DVD. Anyway, I watched the documentary, and I've got a thing. If I like a particular music documentary, I will watch it over and over and over again. Other people don't spend all of their free time watching music documentaries. I don't know what they do with their lives, but not that. But I watch it, and I'm learning all about the history, and I'm getting very, very into it and very interested in all the stories. And I'm learning from it a bit more about the music post the first two albums. So little by little, through my local secondhand record store, Turning Point. That's a plug. I got I got most of their later albums, and I was like, okay, yeah, it does kind of drift on a little more ballad town, a little more pop singles, but there's still a lot of cool instrumental music, and I'm kind of actually enjoying the pop singles as well. I like that a band could do both. So that kicked things into the next phase of my fandom, and I became a full-on fan. I actually sent a message early on to my ex-wife and said, if you and I were still living together right now, I think you'd be pretty sick of Chicago at this point. And one of the things I really liked about the band is, they're a horn band. I enjoy horns. I like horn sections. I'm a Zappa guy, and Zappa frequently had a big horn section backing him up. I like jazz. I like funk. Recently I've gotten into Earth, Wind, and Fire, so I was very into the arrangements that they did and so longer form compositions they did. James Pankow, I'm not sure if I mentioned this before, the trombone player, is an amazing composer. There's a lot of things like Ballet for Girl from Buchanan or any of his longer compositions. Uh, just really shines. It's a lot of a big fan of what he does there. One of the other things that kind of happened around that time where I'm watching the documentary and I'm buying more of the albums is I discovered on YouTube a band called Leonid and Friends, and they're a band from Russia. As I know, there's some Ukrainian members. I'm not sure how that's working out these days. Just I hope hope they're all right now. But they put out YouTube videos and they cover a variety of different bands, but one of their mainstays, they do a lot of covers of Chicago songs. And I'm watching these videos, and it's very helpful for me to get into them because I'm now seeing the performance. It's not, the original musicians, but the arrangements are very, paying very close attention to the original recordings of what's going on. So I'm able to see, oh, that's what's happening in the bass. That's a really cool bass line. Or, oh, wow, that was a very hot solo on the sax. So my enjoyment of them is reaching a new depth. It's taking on some additional layers because I'm hearing more details in what's going on in the original recordings. I just like the blend of melody with innovation that they could do these really sweet sounding singles, but if you pay close attention, there's a lot of cool things happening, and when they do more experimental stuff, I'm hearing even then there's a great great rhythm track happening. Great example is a long form piece on the second album, which is called Chicago. I'll touch on the Chicago numbering system in a bit, but on the second album, there's a suite called Ballet for Girl from Buchanan. And it works as this wonderful long form piece of music, and there's these instrumental stretches. Some of them are kind of Zappa-ish, but there's also parts that were taken out to make singles, and they're really good singles like "Color My World" came from that, and "Make Me Smile," and there's these wonderful songs, but they fit into this great larger work. There's a lot of very intense playing that happens. If you check out some of the live recordings, Terry Kath in particular just burns up on him. He's incredible. Now, just mention the Chicago numbering system because it can be a little bit confusing. Their first album was under the name of Chicago Transit Authority. The first album was called Chicago Transit Authority. The second album was Chicago, number in it. It was just Chicago, but it's considered Chicago 2, but it's just called Chicago. The third album was called Chicago 3. And the fourth Chicago album was Chicago Live at Carnegie Hall. I could have sworn that there was like a volume 4 involved in there somewhere, but I think it was actually it's like Chicago Live at Carnegie Hall volumes 1 through 4, because it was, as I said, it was a quadruple album. Then came Chicago 1, the first 3 albums were doubles, the fourth one was a quadruple. Chicago 5, single album. Chicago 6, single album. Chicago 7 was a double album. It was the last double album they did. Chicago 8, single. Chicago 9 was the greatest hits, but it was Chicago 9. Then 10 and 11. 10 was the one that had If You Leave Me Now on it. Then after 11, Terry Kath died. The 12th album was called Hot Streets, which doesn't fit into the numbering system and name-wise, but it is the 12th Chicago album. That's a bit of a weaker one. Then came Chicago 13. 14 was without Donnie Dacus. 15 was another greatest hits. Then they changed record labels. That's when David Foster started producing. 16 and 17 were the big hits in the early 80s. Then Cetera left, and it was 18, and they continued on after that. It's a bit messy, but once you figure it out, if you're an obsessive geek like I am, you eventually do pick up on this. I do want to touch on the individual vocalists because that's a big part of sort of a bit of the image that some people have. And they say, oh, yeah, there's a ballad band and Peter Cetera was their lead singer. And no, Peter Cetera was never the lead singer of Chicago. Peter Cetera was a lead singer of Chicago. Original lineup had three singers. We'll touch on them. But even in the early 80s period when they were having those hit singles, Bill Champlin was also doing some lead vocals. He was even doing lead vocals on some songs that he shared with Peter Cetera and that were hits. After Cetera left, they still had, as I said, songs that were hits with Jason Scheff on vocals and with Bill Champlin on vocals. So it was never, ever just one vocalist. But going back to the beginning, here's the original members. You had three main vocalists. Peter Cetera had this very strong, pure tenor. I couldn't believe how good it was, being used to like that sort of softer, I keep saying the word soft, but it was a little bit of a mushy sound sometimes. But it was definitely a softer approach. It's much more brilliant and strong in the early days. Terry Kath, this rich, wonderful baritone, and Robert Lamb, who kind of fit in between. We'll talk about each of them in turn, starting with Peter Cetera. I mentioned that documentary. Peter Cetera declined to be interviewed for it, so he doesn't really have much of a say. Frankly, they seem to do a little bit of a hatchet job on him. It's a bit disappointing that his perspective on things wasn't presented. They sort of imply that he wanted more control and kind of was wanting to put himself above the band, and that's why he wound up leaving or being pushed out of the band. If Peter Cetera is the biggest jerk in the world, and I'm not saying that he is, I don't know that he is. I've never met the man, and I probably never will. I'm sure he's quite a nice gentleman. But even if he was, I still feel his side of the story should be told. He was a very important part of the Chicago story. Other thing to remember with Chicago is that who wrote the song isn't always the person who sang lead. 25 or 6 to 4 was a very notable lead vocal from Peter Cetera, but it was written by Robert Lamb. And Peter Cetera wrote Wishing You Were Here, which is on the 7th album, and I think that was a single. It was a beautiful song, but it was sung by Terry Kath. So you can't always tell. A lot of the songs that were written by James Pankow, the trombone player, he said, it's usually a sing-off because I'm not a vocalist, so I don't. Wasn't worried about him being, getting the lead vocal spot. So it's like they usually have several people doing lead vocals on it. But if you listen to that first album and you're coming from the perspective of going to hear some Peter Cetera, you're going to have to wait for a bit. In the original vinyl context, you don't hear any Peter Cetera in a distinctive way at all until right at the end of the last song, Beginnings. You could look it up, but I'm not going to. Where it's mostly sung by Robert Lamb, but right at the end, Peter Cetera's vocals come in and say, "Only the beginning," and it's a very, it's a kind of very bright, sun shining through the clouds type of moment. But you're not, that's when you first hear him on any Chicago recording. Then if you flip the side, which I'm not doing because I'm listening to CDs, but if, on the second side of the 4, the next song that he has, Questions 67 and 68, that's the next song on the album, and that's a Peter Cetera lead vocal. And it's a very powerful, strong vocal, and he just sounds amazing on it. So, maybe don't quite judge all of his vocals by the later work, by the sort of later hits, even as late as 76 with "If You Leave Me Now," because he could deliver the goods vocally, and he was a kick-ass bass player. That's another big discovery of mine. I had a friend of mine, Kevin. I don't know what's up with him. I honestly haven't heard from him since high school. He doesn't seem to be on social media, and he was a heavy metal guy, but I remember him mentioning that he liked, he was a fan of Chicago, and I couldn't okay. I didn't really see how that fit in with anything. And I remember him mentioning that, oh yeah, he's a really good bass player. And I thought, he is? And you kind of have to go back to the early material, but bass playing is very powerful. They were all strong instrumentalists on this. But yeah, so Cetera much more versatile, all round musician than maybe first impressions come. Second guy I want to talk about is Terry Kath. Now, Terry Kath, the guitar player, incredible find. The story goes that Walter Parazater, the sax player, was at a venue and feels a tap on his shoulder, turns around. It's Jimi Hendrix. And Jimi Hendrix just leans forward and says to him, "Your horns are like one set of lungs, and your guitar player is better than I am." That's some pretty big words. I don't know if I'd go so far as to say better than Hendrix, but that's just my extremely high opinion of Jimi Hendrix. But Terry Kath, one of the great lost guitar players, he had this real fire to his solos. He was a great singer. He was a great rhythm player. He was a great lead player, and that's a package just could not be denied. There's a documentary. I remember my friend Jeff, who I mentioned earlier, because I mentioned this documentary. It's called The Terry Kath Experience. And he asked me, where's it showing? I'm saying, it's showing it. You order it from that website that I'm not going to publicize, but the one where you buy lots of stuff from it, and you order the DVD, and they mail it to your house, and you watch it there. Not everything's available on streaming services. Again, old man shouts at cloud. Called The Terry Kath Experience. Anyway, the documentary was made by his daughter, and she really shines a light on his legacy as a musician. Is talking with a lot of people like Joe Walsh, I think Steve Lukather from Toto, and a lot of other of his peers, fellow bandmates. Just helps to show just how gifted a musician he was, and what a great loss it was when he tragically died in 1978. But as a vocalist, he was as rich Ray Charles type, nice rough and gritty vocals. The third vocalist, main vocalist in the original lineup, was Robert Lamb. He tends to get forgotten a little bit, and he shouldn't be. A very flexible, sort of jazzy vocalist. I will say he maybe had the least distinctive vocal style of the three of them. There's some songs where he can sound a bit like Peter Cetera, and some songs where he can sound a bit like Terry Kath. I always said, if it sounds almost like Terry Kath or almost like Peter Cetera, it's probably Robert Lamb. But a very jazzy, flexible vocalist. A wonderful style. And key thing for his contributions, besides being a vocalist and keyboard player, is he was a major songwriter, particularly in the early years. He wrote 25 or 6 to 4. He wrote Does Anybody Really Know What Time It Is? He wrote a lot of the big songs early on. He kind of took more of a backseat when it got to the 80s. David Foster and Peter Cetera were dominant at that point. And frankly, Robert Lamb, not Robert Plant, Robert Lamb, he had some issues. Look up his look up his biography. He's been very upfront about it, but he had needed to clean up his act, and he eventually did and got back up to full strength. But he was less of a force then. But a very, very big part of the early albums are songs written by him. I want to say one thing about the other thing about the documentary. I don't know if this comes across, but regardless of his talent, I'm not particularly impressed by David Foster's. I'll say as a personality. He comes off as a bit smug. There's one moment in the documentary where he says, "I know I'm great. They don't give you 16 Grammys. if you're not great. And he gestures at these 16 Grammys lined up behind him on his piano. I'm thinking, do you deliberately have your Grammys on display behind you so you can gesture at them and tell them that you're great? Anyway, but as I said, I have ultimately come to appreciate some of the stuff that he did, some of those songs. It's not my favorite period, but there's still stuff to enjoy in there. And I just want to touch on some of the live recordings that come up from Chicago. Now, I mentioned the live at Carnegie Hall. Let me just this big mama jama here is the full 16-disc, every show beginning to end, Fancy Dan boxed set. I just want to say, in the early days of my music fandom, I got this book called the Book of Rock Lists, which is exactly what it sounds like, and it had a list of some of the greatest live albums of all, the 10 greatest live albums of all time. And I have a number of those albums. Also was a list of what they decided were the worst live albums of all time. And I have several of those too. And I actually quite like a number of those. I don't see what they have against Procol Harum live with the Edmonton Symphony Orchestra, but I'm a progressive rock geek, so. But one of those was live at Carnegie Hall. It said it was kind of bloated and just long-winded, and I've never heard the original mix of it. Everything I've heard had some sort of tweaking to it. The first version I have of it, they work because the horns weren't necessarily presented to their best ability. Carnegie Hall wasn't really suited for the horns, which given it's Chicago and the horn band is, kind of a not exactly what you call an asset to have the horns downplayed. But they worked on the mix. But the thing is, even on that original version, not original, but the earliest version I've had, Terry Kath on guitar, Danny Serafin on drums are en fuego. It is just an incendiary set of playing for them, and I listened to this full 16-disc set, and it just flew by. There was just so much breathtaking music, it never seemed to drag for me. It is kind of messy. If you're wanting something that's really cinched in tight, and no, it can meander a bit, but there's so much good here. Probably the best document of them live is a 2-disc Live in Japan album, which doesn't fit in the numbering scheme, but it's pretty well available. It's on the Chicago 5 tour. Let's take my notes here. It's on the Chicago 5 tour, and it has a version of Lowdown, which is sung in Japanese, and that's kind of cool. And it's a really wonderful show. Check it out if you're looking to go further. First picks, though, for Chicago fandom. My favorite album is probably the first one, Chicago Transit Authority. I still have strong fondness for those first two. It's kind of jumping a bit in the deep end, but I think it's worth it. And if you want to go a little slower, start with Chicago 5. It's a single album. It's got, I think, the best blend of kind of pop-sounding stuff, early 70s pop, and great playing and longer form stuff. It's got Saturday in the Park, which I think is just a wonderful song. My 3 favorite songs, we'll probably mention this in subsequent videos. My 3 favorite songs when I was 5 years old were The Entertainer by Scott Joplin, used in the movie The Sting, Hit the Road Jack by Ray Charles, and Bad Bad Leroy Brown by Jim Croce. So I was a fan then, as I am now, of a jaunty piano figure. So naturally, when I heard Saturday in the Park, which has got an absolutely bright, beautiful, bouncy piano figure going through it, really cool vocals, I freaked out and partied. And I'm sure there's people listening to this right now might jump to that track. It's like, you partied over that song? Yes, I did. I love that song. One last note is that I did get one chance to see Chicago live. It was in 2019. The Ottawa Jazz Festival. It was the last run of festivals before the pandemic shut everything down, and I got to see it with my completely awesome niece Lily. And it was, she's a horn player, so I was hoping that she might enjoy it, and she seemed to quite like it. I don't say she was a convert, but she got the impression for enjoying the show. So that was a really good memory. They did a great blend of both hits and more instrumental music. They showed off all the aspects of their career. It was a great show. I'm sure if you go see them now, they'll probably do the same thing. And it's worth your while to take a chance to check them out. I'll just say this: early '80s. If you had told me then that I was going to be doing some sort of presentation on how much I loved Chicago, I would have said you're out of your mind. And just goes to show how things change. So, Chicago, that sums it up. It's the longest video yet, I see. Uh, Thank you for staying so far if you have. And join me next time for letter D. Like, share, and subscribe, as they all say. And thank you for joining me. You guys have a great day.